The 17th of January, 1942. The first rays of sunlight broke across the Pacific horizon like molten copper spilling over the rim of the world. Lieutenant Commander Tagami Meiji stood on the conning tower of Submarine 36, his gloved hands gripping the cold steel railing as salt spray kissed his weathered face. Around him, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, indifferent mirror reflecting the bruised colors of dawn. In the distance, faint and ghostly, the California coastline emerged from the marine layer like a sleeping giant, unaware of the steel predator lurking just beyond its dreams. The air tasted of brine and diesel fuel, and beneath his boots, Tagami could feel the rhythmic pulse of the submarine's engines, a mechanical heartbeat synchronized with his own. He turned to observe the peculiar cargo secured to the foredeck, a small reconnaissance seaplane, its wings folded like the limbs of a sleeping insect, glistening with condensation. It was an absurd sight. This fragile bird perched atop a vessel designed to prowl beneath the waves. Yet in that absurdity lay innovation, ambition, and a technological leap that would redefine naval warfare. Tagami did not yet know that this moment, this marriage of submarine and aircraft, would soon become a source of profound terror for commanders on both sides of the Pacific. The concept of submarine-launched aircraft was not born in the desperation of war, but in the calculated ambitions of interwar naval theorists who recognized that the greatest limitation of undersea vessels was their blindness. A submarine could strike with devastating surprise, but it could not see beyond the curvature of the earth. It could not scout enemy harbors, direct surface fleets, or conduct reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines. The Imperial Japanese Navy, obsessed with achieving strategic parity against the resource-rich United States, had embraced this challenge with characteristic thoroughness. Beginning in the 1922, Japanese naval architects experimented with small floatplanes that could be disassembled, stored in watertight hangars, and launched from specially designed submarine catapults. By the late 1930s, these experiments had matured into operational reality. The I-class submarines, massive vessels displacing over 3,000 tons, were among the largest submarines in the world, and they carried within their hulls a technological marvel. The Yokosuka E-14Y, a two-seat reconnaissance floatplane, known affectionately as Glenn by Allied intelligence officers who would later encounter it in combat. The Glenn was an engineering compromise, a delicate balance between structural strength and weight reduction. Its wings folded inward to fit within the submarine's cylindrical hangar, and its engine could be started while still secured to the catapult rail. The entire launch process, from surfacing to aircraft deployment, could be completed in under 15 minutes by a well-trained crew. Once airborne, the Glenn had a range of nearly 500 miles and could remain aloft for over 4 hours, providing eyes for the submarine far beyond the range of periscopes or surface lookouts. It was a weapon designed not for destruction, but for information, a flying extension of the submarine's sensory apparatus. Yet information, as commanders on both sides understood, was often more valuable than firepower. A single reconnaissance photograph could reveal the position of an entire carrier battle group. A well-timed sighting report could doom a convoy or save a fleet. In the hands of skilled operators, submarine-launched aircraft represented a paradigm shift in naval warfare, a fusion of stealth and aerial observation that challenged fundamental assumptions about the sanctity of coastal waters and the security of distant shorelines. But paradigm shifts are rarely implemented smoothly, and the crews who pioneered submarine-launched aviation faced challenges that no training manual could adequately address. The ocean is a capricious mistress, and launching an aircraft from a pitching, rolling submarine deck required not merely technical competence, but a kind of desperate courage bordering on recklessness. The catapult mechanism was powered by compressed air, a violent ejection that hurled the fragile seaplane forward at 60 miles per hour in less than 30 feet. The pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to establish control before the aircraft either gained sufficient lift or plunged into the waves. Recovery was even more perilous. The submarine would surface, and the aircraft would land on the open ocean nearby, taxiing alongside while crane operators hoisted it from the water. During this vulnerable period, often lasting 20 minutes or more, the submarine was exposed, unable to dive, a stationary target for any passing patrol aircraft or warship. Crews trained exhaustively for these procedures, rehearsing in calm seas under controlled conditions. But the Pacific Ocean recognized no training schedules, and when operational necessity demanded a launch in heavy weather or under threat of enemy attack, the margin between success and disaster narrowed to nothing. The Japanese submariners who mastered these procedures were an elite within an elite, volunteers selected for their technical aptitude and psychological resilience. They understood that they were operating at the bleeding edge of naval technology, pioneers in a domain where doctrine was still being written, and every mission generated lessons that would be studied and refined by future crews. There was pride in this role, certainly, but also an undercurrent of anxiety. The aircraft they launched were unarmed scouts, incapable of defending themselves against enemy fighters. If discovered during a reconnaissance mission, the pilot and observer faced almost certain death or capture, and if the submarine was forced to crash dive while the aircraft was still airborne, the crew in the seaplane would be abandoned, left to ditch in hostile waters with no hope of rescue. These were unspoken realities, acknowledged through ritual and camaraderie rather than explicit discussion. Before each mission, pilots would leave personal effects with trusted shipmates, letters to families, photographs, small tokens of a life that might end far from home. It was a gesture that required no explanation, understood by all who served in the silent service. The strategic vision behind Japan's submarine-launched aircraft program was ambitious and, in hindsight, fatally optimistic. Naval planners envisioned squadrons of long-range submarines conducting reconnaissance along the entire American west coast, gathering intelligence on ship movements, harbor defenses, and industrial facilities. These submarines would operate independently, surfacing only briefly to launch their aircraft before returning to the protective anonymity of the deep. The collected intelligence would flow back to fleet headquarters, informing operational decisions and enabling preemptive strikes against vulnerable targets. In the most audacious scenarios discussed in planning rooms in Tokyo, submarine-launched aircraft might even conduct bombing raids against critical infrastructure, power plants, bridges, fuel depots, sowing panic and forcing the Americans to divert resources to homeland defense. It was a vision rooted in Japan's understanding of its own strategic vulnerabilities. The empire was resource-poor, dependent on imported oil, rubber, and metals. A protracted war against the industrial colossus of the United States was a war Japan could not win through attrition. Victory, if it was to be achieved at all, would require psychological impact, the shattering of American morale through spectacular demonstrations of reach and audacity. If American civilians could be made to fear Japanese aircraft appearing without warning over their cities, if the myth of oceanic invulnerability could be shattered, perhaps the political will to continue the war could be broken. But between vision and reality lay the grinding calculus of operational constraints. The I-class submarines were technological marvels, but they were also complex, temperamental machines, requiring extensive maintenance and highly trained crews. Each submarine could carry only one aircraft, and that aircraft could deliver only limited payloads or gather intelligence over a relatively narrow area. The vastness of the Pacific worked against concentrated reconnaissance efforts. To maintain persistent surveillance over even a single major port required multiple submarines rotating on station, a commitment of resources that strained Japan's submarine fleet. And the Americans, though initially surprised by the appearance of submarine-launched aircraft, adapted with characteristic efficiency. Coastal patrols intensified, radar networks expanded, and standing orders were issued to immediately investigate any unidentified aircraft sighting. What had begun as a revolutionary capability gradually became a high-risk, low-reward proposition. Japanese submarine commanders found themselves conducting reconnaissance missions of diminishing value while exposing their vessels to increasing danger. The terror that submarine-launched aircraft initially inspired among Allied commanders began to shift, transforming into a different kind of fear. The realization among Japanese officers that their technological innovation was being neutralized by an enemy with superior resources and adaptive doctrine. The evolution of this fear can be traced through the mission logs and after-action reports filed by Japanese submarine commanders during 1942 and 1943. In the early months following Pearl Harbor, these reports radiate confidence. Submarines operated with relative impunity along the American coast, their aircraft overflying harbors and shipping lanes, photographing naval installations and tracking convoy movements. The intelligence gathered was detailed and actionable. Photographs showed the disposition of ships in San Francisco Bay, the construction progress of new vessels in Seattle shipyards, the layout of fuel storage facilities in Los Angeles. For a brief, intoxicating period, Japanese naval intelligence possessed a real-time picture of American naval activity along the entire Pacific seaboard. But this window of opportunity was narrow and closing rapidly. American radar technology, crude and unreliable in 1941, improved dramatically through 1942. Coastal radar stations began detecting surfaced submarines with increasing reliability, and patrol aircraft were vectored to investigate contacts with growing frequency. The safe operating envelope for submarine-launched reconnaissance missions shrank steadily. Commanders who had once lingered on the surface for hours, calmly recovering their aircraft and processing film, now conducted hurried launches and recoveries, anxiously scanning the horizon for approaching patrol planes. The psychological toll of this evolving operational environment cannot be overstated. Submarine warfare has always been a battle of nerves, a contest of patience and stealth, conducted in claustrophobic steel tubes beneath an unforgiving ocean. Adding the complexity of aircraft operations multiplied the stress exponentially. Crews faced a maddening paradox. The very capability that made them valuable, the ability to launch reconnaissance aircraft, also made them vulnerable, forcing them to surface in daylight, often within sight of enemy shores, transforming from invisible predators into exposed targets. The ritual of aircraft operations became a focus of superstitious anxiety. Crews developed elaborate pre-launch routines, lucky charms, and unspoken hierarchies of omens. A smooth catapult launch was interpreted as a favorable sign, a rough recovery presaged misfortune. When aircraft failed to return, whether due to mechanical failure, enemy action, or navigational error, the psychological impact rippled through the entire crew. The empty hangar became a silent accusation, a reminder of the men who would not return, and the arbitrary cruelty of fate. Commanders found themselves weighing impossible calculations. Was the potential intelligence value worth the risk of detection? Could they justify ordering a launch, knowing that the aircraft crew might be sacrificing themselves for photographs of dubious tactical significance? By mid-1943, the calculus had shifted decisively. American anti-submarine warfare capabilities had matured from improvisation to systematic lethality. Long-range patrol aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges swept vast areas of ocean, forcing Japanese submarines ever deeper into defensive postures. Surface ships, equipped with sonar and hedgehog mortars, hunted in coordinated groups, prosecuting contacts with relentless efficiency. The submarine force that had begun the war as a proud, elite arm of the Imperial Navy was being ground down through attrition, losing vessels faster than they could be replaced. In this environment, the luxury of aircraft reconnaissance became increasingly untenable. Commanders who had once eagerly launched their Glens now hoarded them, unwilling to risk surface exposure, except in the most critical circumstances. The aircraft hangars, once symbols of technological prowess, became expensive ballast dead weight that reduced underwater speed and increased surface silhouette without delivering commensurate value. Some submarines returned to port with their aircraft unused, the hangar spaces still sealed, the catapults never fired. It was a quiet admission of obsolescence, a recognition that the operational environment had evolved beyond the capabilities of submarine-launched aviation. Yet even as the practical utility of submarine-launched aircraft declined, their psychological impact persisted in unexpected ways. For American commanders tasked with coastal defense, the very possibility of submarine-launched aircraft represented an ongoing threat that demanded resources and attention. Every unidentified radar contact, every unexplained aircraft sighting, every anomalous sound detected by coastal listening stations had to be investigated as a potential Japanese reconnaissance mission. Fighter aircraft sat on alert status, ready to scramble against threats that rarely materialized. Patrol vessels conducted endless sweeps of coastal waters, searching for submarines that had long since withdrawn to more distant operating areas. The spectre of submarine-launched aircraft had achieved what actual reconnaissance missions could not: a sustained psychological pressure that forced the Americans to maintain costly defensive postures long after the immediate threat had diminished. Japanese naval planners, aware of this effect, occasionally conducted token reconnaissance missions purely for their psychological value, sacrificing aircraft and crews to maintain the illusion of persistent capability. It was a cruel calculus, trading lives for psychological advantage, but it reflected the desperate strategic position in which Japan found itself by late 1943. The most ambitious and notorious deployment of submarine-launched aircraft occurred in September 1942, when Lieutenant Nobuo Fujita piloted a Yokosuka E-14Y from Submarine 125 on a bombing mission against forests near Brookings, Oregon. The mission parameters were unusual from the start. Rather than conducting reconnaissance, Fujita's aircraft carried two modified incendiary bombs, each weighing approximately 170 pounds. The intended target was not military infrastructure, but the vast coniferous forests of the Pacific Northwest. Japanese planners theorized that incendiary attacks against these forests during the dry season could trigger massive wildfires, destroying timber resources, disrupting transportation networks, and spreading panic among the civilian population. It was psychological warfare elevated to strategic ambition, an attempt to weaponize the American landscape against itself. Fujita launched before dawn on September 9, climbing slowly through pre-dawn darkness until he crossed the coastline near Cape Blanco. Below him, the dark mass of old-growth forest stretched inland, an ocean of trees waiting to burn. He released his bombs over a densely forested area, watched the brief flashes of detonation, then turned back toward the ocean and the waiting submarine. The bombs detonated as designed, igniting small fires in the forest understory. But September 1942 had been unusually wet along the Oregon coast, and the forest floor was damp with recent rain. The incendiary devices burned themselves out within hours, leaving only scorched patches of ground and a handful of smoldering stumps. No major conflagration developed, no panic swept through coastal communities. The attack, from a tactical perspective, was a failure. Yet its psychological impact far exceeded the physical damage inflicted. For the first time in history, the continental United States had been bombed by an enemy aircraft launched from a submarine. The symbolic violation of American territory was profound. Newspapers across the country reported the attack, often with sensationalized headlines that magnified the threat. Coastal residents, already jittery from reports of Japanese submarine activity, began to view the forests and mountains surrounding their communities as potential invasion routes. Military authorities imposed stricter blackout regulations and increased coastal patrols. The actual impact of Fujita's bombs was negligible, but the fear they generated was real and lasting. For Fujita himself, the mission became a source of complex emotions that evolved over the decades following the war. In the immediate aftermath, he was celebrated as a hero in Japan, one of the few pilots to successfully strike American territory. But as the war ground toward its catastrophic conclusion, as Japanese cities burned under American incendiary raids, the irony of his small bombing mission became inescapable. He had dropped 2 bombs on wet forest. The Americans had incinerated entire cities with thousands of tons of incendiaries. The asymmetry was so grotesque as to be almost incomprehensible. After the war, Fujita lived with a burden of guilt and confusion, haunted by questions he could not adequately answer. Had his attack contributed anything meaningful to Japan's war effort? Had he merely provided symbolic validation for the far more devastating firebombing campaigns conducted against Japanese cities? In 1962, Fujita accepted an invitation to visit Brookings, the town nearest to his bombing target. He arrived expecting anger, perhaps even hostility. Instead, he was greeted with curiosity and, eventually, forgiveness. The townspeople understood that Fujita had been a young officer following orders, caught in the machinery of a war he had not started. Over subsequent years, Fujita returned to Brookings multiple times, developing friendships with residents, planting trees to replace those his bombs had burned, and speaking to students about the futility of war. The forest he had tried to destroy became a place of reconciliation, and the bombs he had dropped transformed from weapons into symbols of the possibility of healing. The technical challenges of submarine-launched aviation extended beyond the mechanics of catapults and recovery cranes to fundamental questions of navigation and communication. A submarine operating hundreds of miles from friendly ports had limited means of transmitting intelligence gathered by its aircraft. Radio transmissions risked revealing the submarine's position to enemy direction-finding stations, yet without timely communication, the intelligence gathered became stale and operationally useless. Photographic film had to be developed aboard the submarine using makeshift darkrooms improvised in torpedo storage spaces. The cramped, humid conditions inside a submarine were hostile to the delicate chemistry of film development, and many reconnaissance photographs were ruined by improper processing or storage. Even when images were successfully developed, interpreting them required expertise that few submarine crews possessed. Analysts trained in photo interpretation were stationed at headquarters, not aboard operational submarines. Commanders had to make decisions based on their own amateur assessment of reconnaissance photographs, often missing critical details visible only to trained eyes. The aircraft crews themselves faced navigational challenges that would be considered suicidal by modern standards. The Yokosuka E-14Y carried minimal navigation equipment, a magnetic compass, an altimeter, and a simple clock. Over-water navigation required dead reckoning, a continuous mental calculation of speed, heading, and elapsed time, adjusted for estimated wind drift. Pilots flew low to conserve fuel and avoid radar detection, often navigating by reference to coastal landmarks glimpsed through morning mist or fading twilight. If weather closed in or visibility deteriorated, the margin for error collapsed to nothing. Aircraft that strayed too far from their calculated position might exhaust their fuel searching for the submarine or, worse, stumble over enemy patrol vessels and be shot down before they could retreat. The observer in the rear seat served as navigator, bombardier, and photographer, juggling multiple tasks while cramped in a tiny cockpit with minimal instruments and no protection from the elements. Frostbite was common during high-altitude reconnaissance missions. Air sickness plagued observers who spent hours staring through camera viewfinders while the aircraft bounced through turbulent air. It was unglamorous, exhausting work that received little recognition and offered few opportunities for heroism. When missions succeeded, the credit went to the intelligence analysts who interpreted the photographs. When missions failed, the blame fell on the crew that failed to return. The transformation of submarine-launched aircraft from revolutionary weapon to operational liability unfolded gradually, marked not by dramatic battles, but by the accumulation of incremental failures and unmet expectations. Submarines designed to carry aircraft were larger, slower, and more expensive than their conventional counterparts. The hangar space required for the aircraft reduced the number of torpedoes the submarine could carry, directly impacting its offensive capability. Maintenance of the aircraft and catapult system required specialized technicians, further straining crew assignments. As the war progressed and Japan's strategic situation deteriorated, these opportunity costs became increasingly difficult to justify. Submarine commanders, facing shortages of torpedoes, fuel, and replacement crew members, began to question the wisdom of devoting scarce resources to maintaining aircraft that contributed little to the immediate tactical situation. By late 1944, most I-class submarines had their aircraft hangars converted to carry additional fuel or cargo, a pragmatic acknowledgement that the era of submarine-launched aviation, at least as practiced by the Imperial Japanese Navy, had ended. But the fear those aircraft had once inspired did not dissipate quickly. For Allied commanders who had witnessed the early reconnaissance missions, the memory of Japanese floatplanes appearing without warning over supposedly secure harbors remained vivid. Intelligence assessments continued to warn of Japanese submarine-launched aircraft capabilities long after those capabilities had effectively ceased to exist. Coastal defenses remained alert for threats that were no longer operational. This persistent fear reveals a fundamental truth about military innovation. Perception often lags reality by months or years. A weapon system that achieves even brief operational success casts a long psychological shadow, forcing adversaries to prepare for threats that may no longer exist, while the innovator struggles to maintain a capability that has become obsolete. The Japanese submarine force, having pioneered submarine-launched aviation, found itself trapped by its own innovation, maintaining expensive capabilities to preserve the psychological impact even as the practical utility evaporated. The symbolism of the aircraft itself, a fragile bird launched from a steel predator lurking beneath the waves, captured the contradictions inherent in Japan's strategic position. The submarine represented stealth, patience, and the ability to strike without warning. The aircraft represented visibility, speed, and the acceptance of risk. Their combination was an attempt to reconcile irreconcilable operational philosophies, to achieve the impossible synthesis of invisibility and observation. In the early months of the war, this synthesis seemed achievable. Submarines launched their aircraft, gathered intelligence, recovered their scouts, and disappeared back into the depths. But as American anti-submarine capabilities matured, the contradiction became fatal. The act of launching an aircraft transformed the submarine from hunter to hunted, from invisible threat to vulnerable target. The very moment of technological triumph, the catapult firing, the aircraft climbing away from the deck, became the moment of maximum danger. Crews came to dread the procedure they had once rehearsed with pride. The sound of the compressed air catapult became an omen of exposure, and the sight of the recovered aircraft, dripping and fragile on the deck, became a reminder of how close death had passed. Lieutenant Commander Tagami, who had stood on the conning tower of I-6 during that January dawn in 1942, survived the war, though his submarine did not. I-6 was lost with all hands in July 1944, torpedoed by an American submarine while on patrol south of the Philippines. By that time, Tagami had been reassigned to a staff position, his expertise in aircraft operations no longer required by a submarine force that had abandoned the capability. In post-war interviews, Tagami spoke with careful neutrality about his experiences, neither glorifying nor condemning the submarine-launched aircraft program. He described it as an ambitious experiment that had achieved limited success before being overcome by the evolution of the operational environment. When pressed to assess whether the program had been worth the resources invested, Tagami would pause, considering his words carefully. "We believed we were changing naval warfare," he would eventually say. "Perhaps we did, for a brief time. But warfare changes faster than weapons, and what seems revolutionary one year becomes obsolete the next. We were pioneers, yes, but pioneers who discovered that the frontier we were exploring had already been claimed by others with greater resources and better maps." The legacy of Japan's submarine-launched aircraft program extends beyond the operational history to influence post-war military doctrine and technology development. The fundamental concept using submarines as mobile platforms for aerial reconnaissance proved sound, though the execution was constrained by the technological limitations of the era. Modern nuclear-powered submarines carry cruise missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of miles inland, achieving the strategic reach that Japanese planners envisioned, but with far greater lethality and reliability. The psychological impact of submarine-launched weapons remains a cornerstone of deterrence theory, the knowledge that threats can emerge from the depths without warning, shaping strategic calculations for nations around the world. In this sense, the Japanese pioneers of submarine-launched aviation achieved a conceptual victory even as their tactical implementation failed. They demonstrated that the ocean's surface was not an impenetrable barrier, that submarines could project power beyond the range of their torpedoes, and that the integration of different military domains, subsurface, surface, and aerial could create capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. Yet for the men who served aboard those submarines, who launched those aircraft, and who waited anxiously for their return, the legacy is more personal and more complex. They were elite operators of sophisticated weapons, pioneers at the intersection of technology and courage. They experienced the exhilaration of successful missions and the terror of close escapes. They watched friends disappear beneath the waves or fail to return from reconnaissance flights. They lived with the knowledge that their survival depended on the proper functioning of temperamental machinery and the caprice of weather and enemy detection. In the cramped, stale air environment of a submerged submarine, they confronted fundamental questions about duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of technological progress. The aircraft stored in the hangar represented possibility and vulnerability in equal measure, a symbol of Japan's ambition to compete with wealthier, more industrialized adversaries, but also a reminder of the gulf between ambition and capacity, between vision and reality. The terror that Japanese commanders felt when launching aircraft at dawn was not the simple fear of enemy action, though that fear was certainly present. It was a more profound existential dread, a recognition that they were operating at the limits of their technology and beyond the boundaries of established doctrine. Every aircraft launch was an act of faith, faith in the machinery, faith in the crew, faith in the strategic vision that justified the risk. And as the war progressed, as submarines were lost and missions failed to produce decisive results, that faith eroded. Commanders who had once eagerly sought opportunities to launch their aircraft became cautious, then reluctant, then openly resistant. The revolutionary weapon became a burden. The technological marvel transformed into a liability. This transformation from hope to fear, from innovation to obsolescence, unfolded over months and years, measured not in dramatic battles, but in the quiet accumulation of operational failures and unmet expectations. In the final analysis, the story of Japan's submarine-launched aircraft program is not primarily about technology or tactics, but about the human experience of operating at the edge of possibility. It is a story of skilled professionals attempting to execute an ambitious strategic vision with inadequate resources and insufficient support. It is a story of courage demonstrated not through heroic charges, but through the daily acceptance of calculated risks in pursuit of dubious objectives. It is a story of innovation undermined by operational realities, of psychological impact outlasting practical utility, and of the persistent gap between what military planners envision and what operational commanders can actually achieve. The dawn that Lieutenant Commander Tagami witnessed from the conning tower of I-6, with its fragile seaplane poised on the catapult and the California coast emerging from morning mist, represented both the apex of Japan's submarine-launched aviation capability and the beginning of its decline. The light breaking across the horizon illuminated not just the target area, but the fundamental contradictions inherent in the entire enterprise, the impossibility of remaining hidden while seeking to observe, the futility of technical innovation in the face of overwhelming resource disparities, and the cruel calculus that measures human lives against strategic objectives of diminishing value. That dawn, beautiful and terrible, marked a moment when terror and hope existed in equal measure, suspended in the salt air above the Pacific, waiting for history to render its inevitable judgment.